My name is Michael Hayes. I'm 42 years old, and I live in Millbrook, Tennessee, a town so small that everyone knows everyone else's business. Or at least that's what I used to believe. 25 years ago, my father, Pastor David Hayes, vanished during what should have been the most sacred moment of his ministry. He was baptizing young Sarah Chen in Miller's Creek when he simply disappeared beneath the water. They found Sarah safe on the bank, confused and crying, but my father was gone. No body, no explanation, just silence. I was 17 then, and that day shattered everything I believed about God, faith, and the people I trusted most. The church closed the case quietly, the congregation scattered, and I left Millbrook the moment I turned 18, vowing never to return. But last Tuesday, a local diver named Tommy Rodriguez called me with news that would change everything. He'd been exploring the deeper parts of Miller's Creek for a documentary about the area's history when his metal detector picked up something unusual. What he pulled from the murky bottom wasn't just evidence, it was proof that everything I'd been told about my father's disappearance was a lie. The truth had been buried for 25 years, but some secrets refused to stay hidden forever. And what I discovered next would expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of our small town's leadership, reveal the real reason my father died, and ultimately restore my faith in ways I never thought possible. Would you want to know the truth, even if it destroyed everything you thought you knew? The phone rang at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, jolting me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in weeks. My construction business in Nashville had been keeping me busy, providing the perfect distraction from the gnawing emptiness that had lived in my chest for 25 years. Michael Hayes? The voice was unfamiliar with a slight southern drawl. Speaking. This is Tommy Rodriguez. I'm a commercial diver here in Millbrook. I think I found something that belonged to your father. The coffee mug slipped from my hand, shattering against the kitchen floor. Millbrook. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 5 years, not since my mother's funeral when I'd driven through town without stopping, unable to face the memories. What? Kind of something, my voice came out as a whisper. His wedding ring, sir, and other things. Things that shouldn't be at the bottom of Miller's Creek if what everyone says about his disappearance is true. My legs gave out, and I found myself sitting on my kitchen floor among the coffee and ceramic shards, my hands shaking as I gripped the phone. For 25 years, I'd been told that my father had suffered some kind of accident, maybe a heart attack or stroke, and that his body had been carried downstream by the current. The creek was deep and fast-moving, they said. Bodies sometimes never surfaced. Mr. Hayes, you still there? Yeah, What else did you find? I think you need to see this in person. There's something else, something that's been bothering me since I pulled it up. Your father's Bible was down there too, wrapped in plastic. Whoever put it there wanted it preserved. The word whoever hit me like a physical blow, not whatever. Circumstances or however it happened. Someone had put my father's most precious possessions at the bottom of that creek. I'll be there tomorrow, I heard myself saying, though every instinct screamed at me to hang up and pretend this call never happened. But as I sat there on my kitchen floor, surrounded by broken pieces, I realized I was tired of running. Tired of the questions that haunted my dreams. Tired of the way my faith had died, along with my father in those dark waters. But that was just the beginning. The drive to Millbrook felt like traveling backward through time. Every mile marker, every familiar curve in the road brought back memories I'd spent decades trying to forget. The town looked smaller somehow, more weathered, as if it too had been holding its breath since that terrible day in 1999. Tommy Rodriguez met me at the creek bed, a wiry man in his 50s with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime. Spent underwater, he'd laid everything out on a plastic tarp, my father's wedding ring still gleaming despite 25 years in the water, his leather-bound Bible remarkably preserved in its plastic wrapping, and something that made my blood run cold, a weighted dive belt. "This is what doesn't make sense," Tommy said, pointing to the belt. "Your father wasn't a diver, but somebody used this to keep things down there. The Bible, the ring, they were, all attached to this belt." I picked up the Bible with trembling hands. It fell open to a page marked with a torn piece of paper, Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." In the margin, in my father's careful handwriting, were words that made my heart stop. "If something happens to me, the truth is in the foundation." "The foundation?" Tommy asked, reading over my shoulder. But I knew exactly what my father meant. Our old house, the parsonage beside the church, had a crawl space where my father kept his private papers. As a kid, I'd watched him disappear down there for hours, working on his sermons or handling church business he said was too important for prying eyes. "I need to get into the old parsonage," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Tommy nodded. "I figured you might. The current pastor, Reverend Morrison, he's been asking a lot of questions about what I found, seemed real interested in making sure I didn't talk to anybody about it." The way he said it made my skin crawl. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that made me think maybe I should call you before I called anybody else." We drove to the parsonage in silence. It had been empty for 3 years since the last pastor moved away, and it looked abandoned with peeling paint and overgrown bushes. But I still had my key. My mother had never asked for it back, and I'd never offered. The crawl space entrance was exactly where I remembered, hidden behind the water heater in the basement. Tommy held the flashlight while I squeezed through. The narrow opening, my heart pounding as I felt around in the darkness. My fingers found the loose floorboard on the third try. Underneath was a metal box wrapped in plastic just like the Bible had been. Inside were documents, photographs, and a letter addressed to me in my father's handwriting. "For Michael, if the truth ever needs to be told." What I found next left me breathless. The letter was dated just 3 days before my father's disappearance, and the first line made my hand shake. "Son, if you're reading this," then they succeeded in silencing me. "But the truth about what's been happening in this town is too important to die with me." The letter revealed a side of my father I'd never known. For months before his death, he'd been investigating financial irregularities in the church's accounts. Large donations were disappearing, and when he'd tried to bring it to the attention of the church board, he'd been told to focus on spiritual matters, not worldly concerns. But my father had been a man of integrity, above all else. He'd continued digging, and what he found was a web of corruption that extended far beyond the church walls. The town's mayor, the police chief, and even some of the most respected families in Millbrook were involved in what appeared to be a money laundering scheme using the church's charitable foundation. The photographs in the box showed midnight meetings behind the church, men carrying bags and briefcases, and most damning of all, a clear shot of Mayor Davidson and Police Chief Williams loading what looked like cash bundles into a car parked beside the creek. I sat in that musty crawl space, reading my father's careful documentation of dates, times, and amounts, feeling a mixture of pride and devastating sadness. He'd been trying to protect his congregation, his community, from people who were supposed to serve them. The final entry in his investigation notes was chilling. "They know I know. Morrison suggested I take a sabbatical to think about my priorities. When I refused, he said some accidents are unavoidable. I'm documenting everything here in case something happens to me. The baptism is scheduled for Sunday. I pray I'm wrong about what they're planning." He hadn't been wrong. Tommy and I drove to the current church location. They'd built a new, larger building 5 years after my father's death. Reverend Morrison was in his office, a thin man with nervous eyes who seemed startled to see me. "Michael Hayes," he said, standing too quickly. "I heard you were back in town. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father was complicated." "Complicated how?" Morrison's smile was tight. He had ideas about running the church that weren't always practical. Sometimes good men lose their way when they become too focused on worldly matters instead of spiritual ones. The same phrase my father had mentioned in his letter. I kept my voice casual. "I'm just trying to understand what happened that day. You were there, weren't you?" "I was an associate pastor then. Yes, it was a terrible accident. Your father was troubled in his final weeks. There were concerns about his mental state." "What kind of concerns?" Morrison moved to his window, looking out at the parking lot. He'd been making wild accusations about respected members of our community, paranoid thoughts about corruption and conspiracies. The stress of ministry can be overwhelming for some men. I couldn't believe what I saw through the window. In the parking lot below, Mayor Davidson was getting out of his car, but he wasn't alone. Police Chief Williams was with him, and they were both heading toward the church entrance. After 25 years, the same players were still here, still controlling the narrative. "I should go," I said, but Morrison moved to block the door. "Michael, I hope you understand that dredging up old pain isn't good for anyone. Your father's reputation, his legacy, some things are better left buried." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. As I pushed past him and left the church, I realized that my father's killers weren't just still free, they were still in power, and they knew I was getting close to the truth. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my father's final sermon, the one he'd given the Sunday before his disappearance. I'd been angry with him then, embarrassed by his passionate warnings, about wolves in sheep's clothing, about corruption hiding behind religious facades. At 17, I'd thought he was having some kind of breakdown. Now I realized he'd been trying to prepare his congregation for what he was about to expose. I called my Aunt Linda, my father's sister, who lived 2 states away. She'd been at the baptism that day, one of the last people to see him alive. "Linda, I need to ask you about the day Dad died." "Really ask you?" There was a long pause. "Michael, honey, why are you doing this to yourself?" "Because I found his investigation notes. I know what he was working on before he died." Another pause, longer this time. "I wondered if someday—" "Your father called me the night before. He was scared, Michael, really scared. He said if anything happened to him, I should tell you to look for the witness." "What witness?" "I don't know, but he said there was someone else who knew the truth, someone who could corroborate what he'd found. He wouldn't tell me who, just that they were closer than we think." After we hung up, I sat in my motel room, staring at my father's papers. Who could have been his witness? Someone with access to the same information, someone who would have seen the corruption firsthand. Then I remembered something from the photographs. In the background of one picture, barely visible in the shadows, was a small figure watching the midnight meeting. A child, maybe, or a small adult. Someone my father might have trusted to keep quiet. I drove to the old church cemetery at dawn, hoping the fresh air would help me think. That's when I saw her, Mrs. Chen, Sarah's mother, the woman whose daughter had been in the water when my father disappeared. She was placing flowers on a small grave. "Mrs. Chen?" She turned and I saw tears on her face. "Michael, I've been expecting you." "You have?" "Your father came to me 3 days before he died. He was worried about the baptism, worried that something might happen. He asked me to keep watch, to pay attention to everything." My heart started racing. "You were the witness," she nodded. "I saw them come out of the woods after your father went under, Morrison and 2 other men. They were wet, and they were carrying something heavy in a bag. But when the police arrived, they acted like they'd just gotten there." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" I tried. But who would believe me? Morrison was already spreading stories about your father's mental state, and Mayor Davidson made it clear that grieving minds sometimes see things that aren't there. They offered me money to keep quiet, money we needed for Sarah's medical bills. She broke down crying. "I've lived with the guilt for 25 years, but I kept watching, kept documenting. Your father asked me to be his eyes and ears, so I was." He dropped the bag, and what was inside changed everything. She led me to her car and pulled out a box from the trunk. Inside were photographs, documents, and recordings. 25 years worth of evidence showing the continued corruption in Millbrook. The money laundering hadn't stopped with my father's death. It had expanded. "Mrs. Chen, Why are you giving me this now? Because yesterday Morrison came to my house. He knows you're asking questions. He told me that accidents can happen to anyone, even people who think they're being careful. The same threat my father had received. The same threat that had gotten him killed. But this time, they weren't dealing with an isolated pastor trying to work within the system. They were dealing with his son, who had nothing left to lose and 25 years of anger to fuel his quest for justice. I spent the next day making copies of everything: my father's documents, Mrs. Chen's evidence, the photographs Tommy had taken of the items from the creek. I sent copies to 3 different lawyers in Nashville, with instructions to go to the FBI if anything happened to me. Then I did something that would have terrified my father. I went looking for a direct confrontation. I knew from Mrs. Chen's surveillance that the corruption ring still met regularly, usually at the old mill on the outskirts of town. On Thursday nights, cars would gather there for what locals believed were private poker games. But Mrs. Chen's photographs showed bags of cash and manila envelopes changing hands. At 11 p.m., I parked my truck a quarter-mile away and walked through the woods to the mill. The building was dark except for one window on the second floor. I could see shadows moving inside, and I could hear voices. Using the fire escape, I climbed to a position where I could see through the window. Mayor Davidson was there, along with Police Chief Williams, Reverend Morrison, and 3 other men I recognized as prominent local businessmen. On the table between them were stacks of cash and several ledgers. "The Hayes boy is becoming a problem," Morrison was saying. "He's got Tommy Rodriguez spooked, and now he's been talking to the Chen woman." "Same problem we had with his father," Davidson replied. "Some people just don't know when to leave well enough alone." "What are you suggesting?" This from Chief Williams. "I'm suggesting we handle this the same way we handled it before. Accidents happen, people disappear. Small-town memories are short." My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and started recording. But as I tried to get a better angle, my foot slipped on the wet metal of the fire escape. The sound echoed in the night air like a gunshot. What was that? Williams was on his feet, moving toward the window. I scrambled down the fire escape as fast as I could, but I could hear them shouting, could see flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Behind me, car doors slammed and engines roared to life. I ran through the woods, branches tearing at my clothes, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Behind me, I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, their voices getting closer. "There, I see him!" A flashlight beam found me, and I dove behind a fallen log just as something whistled past my head. They were shooting at me. I couldn't believe what I saw through the window. But just as I thought they had me cornered, red and blue lights began flashing through the trees. Police sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. But these weren't local police. I'd called the state police before coming to the mill, telling them I had evidence of corruption and asking them to monitor my location. Chief Williams must have realized that his own department couldn't respond without raising questions about why they were at the mill. In the chaos, I managed to slip away and make it back to my truck. By the time I reached the main road, there were state police cars everywhere. I drove straight to the state police barracks and turned over my recording, along with copies of all the evidence. The net was finally closing around my father's killers, but I knew they wouldn't go down without a fight. The arrests began at dawn. State police and FBI agents, working with evidence I'd provided and Mrs. Chen's 25 years of documentation, swept through Millbrook like a cleansing flood. Mayor Davidson was taken from his home in handcuffs, his face gray with defeat. Police Chief Williams was arrested at the station, his own officers looking on in shock as federal agents read him his rights. But it was Reverend Morrison's arrest that provided the most satisfaction. He was led from the church during morning service, his congregation watching in stunned silence as the man who'd spent years preaching about moral authority was revealed as a fraud. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed millions of dollars moving through the church's charitable accounts, money that had been diverted from legitimate donations into the pockets of the conspiracy members. Mrs. Chen's photographs and recordings documented payoffs, threats, and the systematic corruption of what should have been sacred institutions. But the breakthrough came when Morrison, faced with federal charges and the possibility of life in prison, finally broke under the weight of his guilt. In his confession, he revealed exactly what had happened that Sunday morning 25 years ago. My father had confronted him before the baptism service, telling him he was going to expose everything after the ceremony. Morrison had panicked and called Davidson and Williams. "We just wanted to scare him," Morrison sobbed during his recorded confession. "We were going to hold him underwater for a few seconds, make him understand what would happen if he didn't back down. But he fought back, and he was stronger than we expected. When he went under, we held him too long. They'd weighted his body and dumped it in the deepest part of the creek, then returned to the surface to discover the tragedy. Sarah Chen had been unconscious from the struggle, and when she came to, they told her she'd nearly drowned, but that Pastor Hayes had tragically been lost trying to save her. The medical examiner's report from 1999 was revealed to have been falsified. The original coroner had found evidence of foul play, but had been pressured to change his findings. That coroner, now in his 80s, came forward to testify about the cover-up he'd been forced to participate in. And just when I thought it was over, God showed me the truth. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when they recovered my father's body from the creek. After 25 years, there wasn't much left, but DNA analysis confirmed his identity. More importantly, they found his prayer journal in his jacket pocket, sealed in a waterproof container he'd apparently carried with him. The final entry, written the morning of his death, brought me to my knees. "Lord, I don't know what today will bring, but I trust in your plan. If I don't survive this, please watch over Michael. Help him find his way back to you when he's ready. Let my death mean something. Let it bring justice and truth to light, even if it takes years. I love you, Lord. I love my son. I'm not afraid." The trials took 2 years. In the end, all 6 conspirators were convicted on federal charges ranging from money laundering to murder. Morrison and Davidson received life sentences. Williams got 30 years. The others received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. The recovered money, over $4 million stolen over the course of 25 years, was returned to the community. Some went to the families who'd been robbed through fake charity scams. Some went to establish a scholarship funded in my father's name. The rest went to fund real charitable work in the community. But the biggest change was in me. For 25 years, I'd carried anger like a stone in my chest. I'd blamed God for taking my father, blamed the church for failing him, blamed myself for not being there to help him. The truth had set me free, but not in the way I'd expected. I stood in the rebuilt church. The congregation had voted to tear down the building where Morrison had preached his lies and start fresh. The new pastor, a young woman named Sarah, yes, the same Sarah who'd been there that terrible day, had asked me to speak at the dedication service. My father used to say that the truth is like light, I told the packed congregation. It might be hidden for a while, covered by darkness or buried deep, but it always finds a way to shine through. Today, we're not just dedicating a new building. We're dedicating ourselves to making sure that truth and justice are never buried again. After the service, I walked to the cemetery where my father was finally buried beside my mother. Mrs. Chen was there, along with Tommy Rodriguez and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by the truth we'd uncovered. "I kept my promise, Dad," I whispered, placing a Bible on his headstone, the same Bible that had been preserved in the creek, the one that had led me to the truth. Justice was served, the truth came to light, and I found my way back. I took communion for the first time in 25 years and felt peace again. As I walked away from the grave, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was 17 years old. Hope. Not just hope for justice or truth, but hope that even in the darkest places, even in the deepest waters, God's love endures. I'd thought God had abandoned us that day at Miller's Creek, but looking back, I could see His hand in everything. In May, Tommy's discovery, in Mrs. Chen's courage, in the way the evidence had been preserved against all odds. God hadn't abandoned us. He'd been working patiently, quietly, preparing for this day of reckoning. The church bells were ringing as I got in my truck to drive home, not to Nashville, but to the small house I'd bought in Millbrook, the town I'd sworn never to return to. I was needed here now, not just to help the community heal, but to continue my Father's work of standing up for truth and justice. Maybe God never left. Maybe He was waiting for me to look again. Tell me in the comments, would you forgive them?